2000's Merlin, The Return is a film that's been sat in my to-watch pile for as long as I can honestly remember. It was one of the first films I picked up when I first started collecting strange movies from thrift stores back in the mid-2000s. And I grabbed it purely on the cover alone, which featured a long-haired Rick Mayall looking a bit mysterious, backed by what can only really be described as an aqua and blue-coloured void. For those of you unfamiliar with Rick Mayall, he was a British comedian and actor whose on-stage persona was a larger-than-life, arrogant and self-centred so-and-so, who was a wonderfully persnickety character who always had an opinion on things, always had to be the centre of attention, but was always ultimately played as a bit of a sad or lonely figure, but an unaware one. His character was so self-absorbed he never really stopped to think that his life was rubbish, because he was great. When paired up with his lifelong friend Adrian Edmondson, things got a lot more slapstick, with arguably some of the best physical comedy the 80s scene ever produced. Over here, he's quite legendary for roles including The Young Ones, Bottom, Blackadder, Kevin Turvey, and the comic strip. He was seen as an anarchic figure, and while the real Rick could be playful, he was also arguably one of the most generous celebrities of his time, frequently donating to charities and spending significant portions of his time purely on responding to fan mail and attending schools and colleges to talk to students and help them build their craft. All while breaking in and out of character, of course. Then, he died, at the age of 56 on a summer afternoon in 2014 of a totally out-of-the-blue heart attack. And, well, the UK's never really been the same since. The word national treasure would have made him do a sick, but he really was. To a certain subsection of the British population, Rick Mayall was their first foray into alternative comedy, and a visualisation of the side of British eccentricity that just never really made it to air at the time. He caught the peak of the 80s counterculture movement, and it really helped cement him as a prominent figure of the time. The reason I mention this is because, well, Rick's humour, his characters, his performances were very much misunderstood outside of the UK. He tried for years to break into Hollywood. Executives loved his energy, tone and persona, but they almost always fumbled the ball with him, either not really knowing how to market him as a performer, see Drop Dead Fred, a somewhat flawed film that I adore, but one that has terrible marketing right from the off, leading to it attracting the wrong kind of audience. Or in the case of today's film, they had no idea how to write for him, so they just didn't even try. Merlin, The Return was a transatlantic co-production. What that translates to here is an American budget shot largely in the UK with one or two American actors to give the film enough of a presence that it could be marketed in the UK or the US. So you'd think, given Rick's status over here as Mad King sex god of the universe, a film where he got to play the great eccentric wizard himself would be an amazing run, surely. Well, brace yourself. The film's plot isn't confusing per se, but I get the feeling that they didn't really know what order to run the plot information in because there's just so much information being dished out in the opening 20 minutes or so that they basically gave up trying to make it a linear narrative for a while and just threw scenes at the screen until they'd got everything they needed to set up out in the open. As such, if I tell you the plot as it happens on screen, I feel you'll have an aneurysm. So, to save us both a hospital bill, I'll just tell you what happens in the best order that I can put together. So the opening of the film establishes that 1500 years in the past, from 1999, a great battle took place between King Arthur and his knights led by Merlin, and an evil sorcerer who also commanded an army by the name of Mordred. The battle raged for years before eventually coming to a head at Stonehenge, when Mordred and Merlin had a final encounter. But Mordred owned the magical sword Excalibur, so he had the advantage. With all seeming lost, Merlin pulled back from the battle and Mordred seemed to declare victory. But Merlin had one final trick up his sleeve. Summoning the last of his power, he trapped the entirety of both armies, Arthur, Mordred and himself, in what I'm going to call, for lack of a better word, a time lock. He basically froze them in time in a pocket dimension at the site of Stonehenge. But not before Mordred would unveil one final secret to King Arthur. That his most trusted knight, Lancelot, had been seeing Arthur's wife, Guinevere. Anyway, they get frozen away, but just before this film opens, something happens off screen. We meet a scientist called Maxwell, who's studying the magnetic poles of the Earth to try and learn more about its rotation and the powers that it holds. During a rather large experiment on the poles, she accidentally created a schism in the time lock that Merlin dumped everyone into, breaking into the pocket dimension just enough that Mordred could begin to move within that dimension, and in doing so he could begin to plan his escape. Which he does by commanding Maxwell to find his ancient helmet that contains large traces of his power, and then sending her to visit a medium with whom she's able to communicate with a ghostly Mordred who full-on possesses the medium and sets about getting her to pivot her magnetic experiments towards busting open the time lock completely and freeing everyone trapped inside. There's one thing, however. When Mordred got unfrozen, Merlin did too. And when we do pick back up with the film, Mordred's managed to unfreeze most of the army and is preparing them for their release, and when Merlin sees all of this, he escapes into the tunnels of the pocket dimension, eventually finding a larger schism which he then escapes into in an attempt to try and locate Arthur and his knights who seem to have already escaped. And it's around this time that we're introduced to our child actors for the film, in the form of Kate and Richie. Kate is the younger daughter of the medium Maxwell is speaking to Mordred through, and she's been watching these exchanges and is deeply concerned by Maxwell's behaviour. She doesn't want her in the house, but her mum is much more forgiving. Richie, by contrast, is an all-American punk kid, whose dad's just died, and so his mum's decided to move to England, to the middle of nowhere, to have a bit of a fresh start. And he's a miserable bastard because, quite rightly, he doesn't want to be trapped in some bizarre PG Woodhouse throwback village where everyone drives 1920s cars for some reason. Especially when he could be, I don't know, pouring Sunny Delight directly into his eyes and face and getting up to shooting people or something. I don't know what 90s American kids did. Anyway, while arriving in the village, Richie's mum and aunt very nearly kill Merlin, who materialises in the middle of the road before just sort of silently running off. That's really all that happens. Richie's moaning about not knowing anyone in the village until Kate comes in, the pair talk Nintendos and then head off to go play some video games. Out in the woods, it's revealed that Arthur and his knights have been training and are attacking great beasts, read here as lorries that are passing on a nearby road. But it doesn't take long for Merlin to bump into him, and even less time for the pair to head back to a seemingly abandoned cottage to catch up about what's going on and to try and decide the next steps. While this is going on, Kate and Richie catch Maxwell once again using Kate's mum to talk to Mordred, and the pair decide that she's evil and must be stopped, despite them not really seeing anything that would suggest that she actually is evil. So, they hide in the back of her car and hitch a ride back to Maxwell's research facility, and for some reason Merlin is there too, disguised as a scientist. I don't know either, the film doesn't really explain. Anyway, all three congregate in the main lab, though none of them know who the others are, and Maxwell reveals that she's built a system that'll rip open a portal into the pocket dimension, allowing Mordred and his army to just walk on through. Though, as soon as she revs up the portal, Merlin basically just starts shooting stuff and the kids start spraying the guards with a hose pipe. The portal is heavily damaged, and Merlin, the kids and Guinevere, who managed to push herself through the portal, all escape the facility and into the woods. And basically, the rest of the movie could be summed up as Arthur, Merlin, the kids and the army begin to plot on how to stop Maxwell from reopening the portal, and Maxwell and her team relocate to Stonehenge in an attempt to draw maximum magnet power to the site of the portal's origin. Along the way, meeting back up with Lancelot and fighting all kinds of witches and demons too. In a thrilling finale, will Richie and Kate manage to stop Maxwell? Will Mordred wield Excalibur and take over the world? And why is Merlin so bloody dull? Some of these things will be answered if you watch Merlin the Return. Now, I don't know if the plot I've just explained sounds interesting or fun to you, but to me, when I heard the overview plot of this thing, my mind kind of went to Hocus Pocus by the way of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. I was imagining some kind of cheeky, high-energy Merlin blowing shit up and turning people into geese, ranting on and on about the old-timey ways, about how amazing he is as a wizard, best in the business, while being completely unable to use a tin opener. I had visions of medieval armies being mistaken for historical recreational societies, of Mordred being confounded by television, or of there being a disconnect between modern language and the old ways of ye's and yours. This is not the case, because what Merlin the Return is dull. Deathly dull. Violently, aggressively dull. Things get off to a bad start with the script really, because the first 20 to 30 minutes or so that make up the first act are incredibly messy. They seem to know that they need to have all the characters in specific positions for the start of the second act, but there isn't really a dominating key plot line that stands above the side plots. As such, they don't seem to know what to lead with, and the whole thing ends up feeling like they just threw whatever felt right at the screen, whether it technically worked or not. It just results in a very uneven and messy introduction to your film's plots and characters, which is really off-putting and makes it hard to keep track of what's happening and why it's happening. To the point that, by the time the second act started up, I had to pause the film for half an hour to go back through my notes just to figure out who people were, why they were doing what they were doing, and what the point of all this was. Things get worse, however, as we then swap messy for just dull. The second act slows things right down to a crawl. It essentially becomes people swapping lore in various locations, which would be fine if this was part of a series, but it isn't. There's very little actual meat here for the cast to work with, and it gives way to what I can only describe as the dullest third act that I've seen in a long time. Bearing in mind this finale features a full-blown 3 to 4 way magic fight between two of the greatest wizards who've ever lived, which is somehow rendered the most beige experience that I've sat through in a good while. It's not helped either by the ultra-basic dialogue that feels totally devoid of any kind of character, nuance, charisma or charm. Everything is very literal and intentional, which, for a bog-standard swords and sorcery picture, would be fine. But you have Rick Mayall on your cast list. And instead of leaning into, the thing he's been known for the better part of 30 years by that point, they just give him normal person dialogue. Normal person dialogue that seems purposefully written in such a way that it couldn't be camped up or made enjoyable in any sense. Probably its biggest issue though is that it won't commit to a tone. It has a couple of lighter moments, but nothing funny enough to earn it comedy status. It tries to lean more towards the stoic action fantasy genre, but the budget won't allow for it, and as such, it kind of ends up just coming across as non-committal to any kind of a stance. It's built to disappoint everyone, basically. In short, this is a slice of plain white toast disguised as a script. A bland and uninteresting piece that can't even decide what it wants to really even be. It takes a great idea of dragging a load of medieval beings into the present day and then does absolutely nothing with that premise. It might as well have been about two kids being pulled back in time for all the relevance the time travel element has. And the audacity to bring magic characters into this and then give them almost nothing to do with that magic profoundly upset me in multiple ways. The script was written and directed by Paul Matthews. He has 15 writing credits and 9 directing credits, though he is also a producer, with 18 credits to his name in that field. He mainly seems to work in period dramas and kids' films, with an emphasis on films set in Western times, with notable entries being films like The Last Leprechaun, Breeders and The Little Unicorn. The direction is competent. That's about the nicest thing I can say about it. Technically it's on the level and does deliver an end product that's largely to standard. It's also painfully stylised to feel like a 90s TV movie. Specifically the kind of film that would play on Sunday afternoons on ITV in the UK. It's got a heavy colour correction applied to it, but its stylisation is really just the same kind of filtering that almost all sci-fi and fantasy TV shows were using around that time. It doesn't stand out from any of the other noise coming from that era. And while I can commend the crew for at least just about pulling all the technical aspects of the production together, the direction of the cast is really lacking. It feels like most of the time they were just told when they were in the middle of the shot and that's about it. Some of the deliveries desperately needed retakes that just don't happen, and it feels like there was very little guidance on set manoeuvrability too. Everyone seems fairly unsure of where to move to and what to touch, and a lot of this film has the cast planted firmly in place unless told otherwise, which only adds to the dreariness. The Cine's not much better. With this kind of genre of filmmaking, the Cine and editing really are make or break. You've got to keep things relatively fast-paced, keep the energy up, and really sell that old-timey way of combat. You need well-framed suspense shots, you need decent cuts to help bring your sequences to life. This film has none of that. The composition for the most part is purposefully wide or mid-wide, we don't get any significant close-ups, the cuts are kept fairly consistent but slow, they rely heavily on CG to try and save the day, but it's not aged great. The whole thing feels almost like you're watching the film at arm's length, never truly getting to grips with the action on screen. I've mentioned it earlier in the review, but the final fight between Merlin and Mordred really is the bane of this thing. It's all shot in mid-wide and wide-angle shots, the editing is really slow and the CGI feels bulky. For action scenes like this, you really need to get up close to the cast's faces. You need low and high angles to help illustrate the tides of battle taking place. You want to be close enough to feel the sparks flying, to see the sweat, to, feel involved. In places it felt like the film almost wanted to avoid getting into the action for some reason, which is just mad for a film like this. Which leads me to probably one of the most important questions that this film doesn't answer. If it isn't trading on comedy, it isn't trading on being stoic or serious, and it isn't even trading on high-octane intense magic battles, what is this fantasy film actually doing? Performance-wise, I'm sure you can guess it. I'm not going to talk about the child actors in this one, but the broader supporting cast are a mixture of US and UK actors, and not one of them rises above okay. They're all stilted, awkward, and deliver their lines with a level of cringe that just came across as awkward. Patrick Bergin as King Arthur is just not fit for the role. He has no sense of grandness, no kingliness about him. He reminds me of Gareth Hale from Hale and Pace and just has zero interest in being there. He reads his lines as requested, moves when he needs to, and then gets off the set. That's it. Rick Mayall here was a totally wasted and pointless casting. They give the guy with specialties in egotism, charisma and self-deprecation a completely straight role, with little to no development and no real point other than to occasionally use magic, and using magic here isn't making people fly or forcing people to have a sausage for a nose, it's using magnetism to damage people. And that's about it. Mayall yawns through this script. It's clearly a paycheck gig to him, but I feel annoyed at what we could have had versus what we got, which, for Mayall, was really not a lot. In fact, almost all of the cast give the vibe that this was a paycheck gig and nothing more. Something to keep the wolves from the door for 3 months and to get them another notch on their CV. Illustrated perfectly by this film's making of, which is 19 minutes long and is about 9 minutes of footage from the movie and 9 or so minutes of talking head footage with Mayall, Bergin and some of the supporting cast looking fairly fed up and giving very sarcastic enthusiasm towards the film. Which is surely a sign of quality right there. In fact, the only person involved in this film who genuinely did seem to think this was going to be a huge success was Craig Sheffer as Mordred, and he's arguably one of the better cast villains in this thing. He comes across about on par with an 80s Doctor Who baddie, so make of that what you will, but in the making of, he genuinely seems to think this film will be held in as high a regard as some of the old Robin Hood and Ray Harryhausen Sword and Sandals movies. He seemed to have a lot of fun with it, and he seems to be one of the only cast members to really get into his role. So, you know what? Good for him. He did alright. And finally, the soundtrack. It's cursed. Because what we have here is an actually not too bad score, all things considered. It's fitting for the film, orchestral if not a little forgettable. The problem is, whoever cut this thing had no idea of when to use music and when not to. As such, action-heavy scenes will basically have late 70s Brian Eno style elevator trance music playing, while the more mundane scenes either have ill-fitting scoring or no score at all. It seems to almost purposefully hit every wrong timing that it can from start to finish. There's not one moment I can recall where the music hit just right or punctuated a scene perfectly. Every single scene, it either came in too late, too early, or wasn't the right kind of music for the scene. It's atrocious. As is the ADR here, which doesn't match the on-set stuff at all and feels awkwardly inserted. I feel like whoever edited this film was not an editor by trade. Merlin: The Return was released on VHS and DVD in 2002 by Jigsaw Distribution on behalf of Peak Viewing Family Entertainment. The US DVD release came with the soundtrack on an additional CD, but we here in the UK weren't so lucky. The picture quality for an early 2000s DVD has held up remarkably well, all things considered. There was minimal compression, but otherwise it was fine. Extras are better than I could have hoped for, really. We have a 19-minute making of that doesn't really add anything of value, and a brief featurette on the history of Merlin as a historical fictional figure. It's fine. Its last outing was in 2017, when it was picked up by the plucky folks at Riff Tracks, who no doubt gave it a damn good drubbing, and I should really go and check that one out. Coming out right as the Harry Potter craze was kicking off, a few years into the books being released and 1 year away from the first book being adapted to screen, it's hard not to look at Merlin the Return and think it's some kind of cash-in attempt that used Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves and Hocus Pocus as a base to run with something. But it's so passive about its own existence that it makes it hard to hate it, but even harder to love it, honestly. With a dry and uninteresting script, generic and by-the-numbers Cinean direction, an ill-fitting score, and a cast who absolutely cannot be arsed to be there, I don't know really who Merlin would be recommendable to these days. Your magic enthusiasts more than have their fill of the fantasy subgenre, King Arthur fans will likely be disappointed, swords and sorcery fans won't get satisfied by this really. I think even kids movie enthusiasts would have a hard time being won over by this thing. I likely won't watch it again. I don't have anything against it other than the fact it wasted Rick Mayall. Other than that, it's just a bit of a nothing film really.